Good evening. Please explain the apparent paradox of God being all power and God being none power. Of course, you have been reading The Thunder of Silence. And you may have heard some of our class tapes on this subject of all power and none power. And now, if you can grasp or feel what I give you, you will have solved for yourself one of the greatest mysteries of the entire spiritual world. One of the mysteries, the secret of which has been lost for centuries and is now rediscovered. One of our scientists early in the century, when asked what the great discovery of the 20th century would be, replied that it would be the secret of spiritual power. In other words, the secret of spiritual power has not been known on earth since the Master walked the earth. That is the last time that this subject has been explained and taught. The secret of it disappeared from the earth for reasons which can never be duplicated. And never again will the secret of spiritual power be lost to the world. And this spiritual power, the understanding of it, is that which alone can save you individually and this world collectively. Throughout all of the scriptures of the world, you will find that God is supposed to be the great power which overcomes all other powers. In other words, whenever there are negative powers, evil powers or forces, there is an appeal to God, a prayer to God. And in all of these centuries, God hasn't answered. If you knew how many centuries prayers have been uttered to God to heal the sick or to abolish disease and many other evils that are in the earth, and yet they not only continue but multiply, one would imagine that God had some reason for refusing to use his power over these evils. Some years ago, when a magazine, national magazine, questioned a rabbi, a priest, and a minister on this very question, all three answered, "We do not know why God does not do these things for people, why he doesn't remove wars, or sins or diseases. Maybe even God permits them so as to draw his children back to him, which would be comparable to your murdering your children so that they would love you more. Now, you know that that's fantastic. You know that there is no such thing as God punishing anyone, because you know that Jesus Christ gave it as his specific mission to do the will of the Father that sent me. And what was that will? It was to prove that disease was not of God and could be thrown out, to prove that death was not of God and could be thrown out, that lack was not of God and could be thrown out. In other words, the Master, Christ Jesus, claims that the will of God is that we have health, life, abundance, purity. It should be shocking, perhaps, to some of the religious world to discover in the New Testament that the Master was not sent on earth to punish sinners, but to forgive them. Neither do I condemn thee, and I am doing the will of my Father. Thy sins be forgiven thee, and I am doing the will of my Father. In no instance did he ever act as a medium to punish, not even the most terrible of sins. Always his function was to forgive. Forgive 70 times 7. That means, of course, infinitely. So you see that the evils of this world were never meant to exist. They were never meant to be on earth, and there never has been a power to remove them by the power of God. When the Master did the will of God in healing disease, it wasn't by praying to God to do it. It was by realizing that disease is not a power. He says to the crippled man, "What did hinder you? Pick up your bed and walk." He did not say, "God is going to lift you up and restore you." He said, "What did hinder you? What power is there if God is power?" To the blind man, he gave no prayer to God, but rather said, "Open your eyes," as much as to say, "What is hindering you? What power is there?" And the man opened the eyes. Every year, thousands upon thousands of people go to Lourdes to be healed. And the authenticated records show that only about 15 people out of 100,000 receive their healing at Lourdes. And this brought up a serious question in the mind of Dr. Alexis Carrel, and he decided to investigate. Why do 15 people out of 100,000 receive their healings? Why does God only answer 15 people's prayers? But he soon found out. He investigated those 15, and he found out that there was one thing in common among them that was not true of the other 99,985. These 15 did not pray for their health. They remembered somebody else who was suffering more than they, and they prayed for someone else. In other words, they were willing to give up their own life for someone else. And in that unselfedness, their healing took place. Not because God picked them out, but because they discovered the secret of spiritual power. Unless you lose your life will not be saved. Unless you are willing to lay down your life. And you remember how consistent the Master was when he said, "It profiteth you nothing to pray for yourselves or your friends. Pray for your enemies." In other words, when you are willing to become disinterested in yourself, he really didn't mean that you shouldn't pray for your friends, but what he meant is there is no virtue, no spiritual power in praying only for your friends. Until you take up the task of praying for your enemies, you have no spiritual power. The praying for friends and relatives is at best a selfish activity, not an unselfish one, if we pray for them exclusively. It is only when we pray for the stranger. You remember the story of the man on the road to Jericho? They all passed by except one. But that one stopped and cared for the man on the road to Jericho, bound up his wounds, provided housing for him, and in this unselfed act proved spiritual power. We have no way of knowing in what way the blessing returned unto that man. But this we know through of spiritual law, that the man who took care of the other man received a greater blessing than the one who was helped. So it is, then, that you will discover that if God were doing the healing, we would all be healed equally, because God is no respecter of persons. Also, you will find that there are no exceptions in the law of God. God doesn't have the sun move around or the earth move around for some personal reason and hold it up one day and double its speed the next day. There are no exceptions in the laws of God. What God does is forever, and it is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And therefore, God could not make an exception of one person and heal them and let their neighbor next door be unhealed. No, the answer lies in an understanding of spiritual law, spiritual power. And you'll find that spiritual power is the all and only power that governs this universe. In other words, all of the laws of nature are emanations of spiritual law. Behind electricity and electronics and atomics and all the rest of it, there are spiritual laws. Now, these laws are power in that they are forever the same. The power of God maintains, just let us say 2 times 2 is 4. or H2O as water. God maintains and sustains the laws of the universe by his power. But in that regard, God is the only power, and there are no powers to operate against the law of God. For instance, there are no powers that can prevent H2O being water. There are no powers that can prevent 12 times 12 being 144. There are no powers that can upset the movement of the spiritual creation. God is the only power, in that all it is an emanation of God, governed by God in the spiritual universe. And in that sense, then, God is the only power. Now, when we come to God being none-power, we mean that God is not a power in the sense of being able to do anything to upset his own laws, or being a power that can be used for any purpose. Now try to understand this about spiritual power. It cannot be used. You can use the laws of electricity. You can use the laws of nature. You can use mental laws, material laws, but you cannot use spiritual laws. But spiritual law can use you. Spiritual law can manifest itself as your life and being, but you cannot use it. You can come into an awareness, an understanding of spiritual law, and thereby the spiritual law operates as grace in your life. But you cannot influence it to do that. You can't pray it into doing that for you. You cannot bribe God into doing that for you. You cannot promise to be good and have God do it for you. You can't even be good and have God do it for you, because what God is doing, and no man can influence God. The whole theory of influencing God, as we do in the religious world through prayer, is based on the ancient paganistic practice of praying to gods many. A god of the weather, a god of rain, a god of fertility, a god of this, a god of crops, a god that's going to help you overcome your enemy, a god of war. And in their ignorance, the pagans really believed that God was going to do something for them even against their neighbor. I don't know to what degree of spiritual ignorance people can come to actually believe that they can pray to their God to harm somebody else, as if any one of us were so much better than anyone else that we should be favorites of God. Now, when Father Abraham came along, he discarded all of these gods in order to have one God. But whether or not he made the mistake or his future followers made it, they lapsed right back into the pagan practice of asking that God to go out and slay their enemies. They prayed to that god to do something to their crops or something to their weather. In other words, prayer became just as paganistic as it was before, except that it was all addressed to one supposed being instead of a dozen mythical characters. But the God that the Hebrews prayed to was just as mythical as the ones the pagans prayed to. And the proof of it is they got the same answers, or lack of answers. And those who pray to God today to do something for themselves, for their children, for their parents, are just going back to the same paganistic practices that existed thousands of years ago. Because, answer yourself. Ask yourself and answer yourself. If there is a God, why should he heal my mother and not all the other mothers in the world? Why should he heal my father or my sister or my brother and not all the others in the world? What is so wonderful or different about my relatives or friends that God should do something for them that he isn't doing for the others? Well, let's put it this way. What is there so wonderful about one rabbi, one minister, one priest, or one practitioner, so much different than another, that God should heed the prayers of one more than another? Can you solve that? Can you reconcile within yourself a God that will answer the prayers of one religious light and not another? Do you actually believe that there is a God that cares which particular church you wish to kneel in? Do you really believe there is a God that would answer prayer by your going into a church with a crucifix, but wouldn't go into a church with a star? How foolish can we get? And how can we limit God? What kind of a God? How finite must God be if he will answer the prayers of one metaphysical practitioner and not another metaphysical practitioner? And sometimes be willing to answer the prayers of one metaphysical practitioner in the movement, in one movement, and not another metaphysical practitioner in that same movement with the same teachings. How ridiculous are we? Oh no. God power is not to be invoked by man. God power is not attained by influencing God in our behalf. God power is not a power over sin, disease, or death any more than light is a power over darkness. The truth is, there is no such thing as darkness. Darkness is only an absence of light. It is not a presence. It is not an entity. It is not a substance that you can examine under a microscope. You can't capture a piece of darkness to examine it, because there is no such thing. Darkness is the absence of light. In the same way, there is no sin, disease, or death that God can heal. God is the only creative, maintaining, and sustaining power, and God never made sin, disease, or death, or you couldn't ever have them removed. What God created is forever. And if God ever created a disease or a law of disease, you might as well give up all hope of ever overcoming it, for you never are going to overcome God or God's works. God, then, is all power in that God is the only creative, maintaining, and sustaining power, and that which God did not create was not made. We're right back in Genesis. God looked upon all that he made and found it good. And anything that God did not make was not made. If God made sin, disease, and death, give up your hope. Give up your hope of overcoming them. Because God didn't make anything that he's going to let you disrupt. Therefore, your healing power, which means your spiritual power, is only in knowing the truth. That is your only spiritual power, knowing the truth. God is the all creative, maintaining, sustaining power. Anything that God did not create was not made, and therefore we don't need any God power to do something that never was made in the beginning, that never had existence, and that represents only our ignorance of the truth. Now let us prove this, because you must remember, in our work, everything has to be demonstrable. Otherwise, you're back in the land of theories, or creating a new religion for somebody to worship in ignorance. In our work, you must prove what you teach, or what you accept. And while you may not, and probably will not, prove it 100% in this present age, you will prove it to a sufficient degree so that you will know that you have discovered the law. When any of you have turned to a metaphysical practitioner and experienced healing, do you not realize that that practitioner could only know the truth? They did nothing to your body. They could not invoke the aid of God any more than you could yourself. If anybody could invoke the aid of God, I'm sure there are and always have been very dedicated rabbis, priests, and ministers of all faiths and all denominations. And there isn't any reason why they couldn't have invoked the aid of God, as well as some metaphysician who's only devoted 1 or 2 or 3 years to the study, and some even less. We have an experience right in this very classroom of a 16-year-old child within this past week bringing out 4 healings. And you know that if that could be true, if it had ever been done through invoking the aid of God, there are others long before who could have done it better. I don't know. God is not a power that you can use. God is not a power over sin, disease, death, or lack of limitation. God is all power as the creative, maintaining, and sustaining principle, and that power operates in your consciousness in proportion as you know this truth. As you begin to realize God's omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience you will find that you need no power. You do not live by might or by power, but by my Spirit. You do not labor for good. You receive it by grace. When you have learned not to resist evil, not to fight it, and not to try to get God to fight it for you. When you have learned the unreal nature of what appears as the discords in this world, the illusory nature of these appearances, your very acknowledgement of their illusory nature is the spiritual power. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Ye shall know the truth. The only reason that you go to a practitioner or need to is because you are not yet sufficiently strong in your conviction about God. You will notice in all of the Infinite Way writings that the greatest stress is placed on two subjects: the nature of God and the nature of error. Now, if you knew God aright, even in a measure, you would know that God is God, and there's no use you're trying to make God be God. God is already God. And your understanding of that and your conviction of that would be enough. God is. What is God? Well, if we must define it, God at least is omnipotence, which means all power. Then what power is there in this physical, mental, moral, financial condition? If God is all power, there is no power in any negative condition. God is omnipresence. But here you come into a mystery. Here is probably the last thing you want to acknowledge. If God is omnipresence, you are the presence of God. Now, why not think about that word omnipresence for a moment? Omni means all presence, the only presence. Oh, how easy it is to mouth that and say God is omnipresent, or even sing hymns. But that is not knowing the truth. Let's know the truth for a minute about omnipresence. Omnipresence, all presence. All presence. All presence must mean no other presence. It must mean then even I have no presence. I'm the little man who wasn't there. Why? Because God fills all space. And that doesn't leave any room for me. Except in the degree that I am a part of that omnipresence. That wipes out that false selfhood, that ego selfhood. That leaves only the divine selfhood, which I am, which you are, which he is, which she is, which it is, speaking of the dogs and the cats and the birds and the fish. That is why eventually we will not eat meat. It wasn't meant that we should live off of each other, prey upon each other. It wasn't meant that one had to kill another to sustain life. It is only that we have become used to that in our bodies because of the centuries in which it has been done. But just as we are learning here, there, and the other place to do away with capital punishment and even to plan ways of doing away with wars, so will we eventually find ways of eating without taking life. That will come. It is all a process of evolution. It can't be forced on anyone. I see that here in California they failed to pass this non-death penalty bill. In other words, they're going to linger a little bit longer in the old Hebraic teaching of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, even while attending a Christian church. Doesn't seem inconsistent to them. Seems perfectly natural. It's been done always. Live the old Hebraic life and go to a Christian church. But someday, somebody will call their attention to the fact that they ought to go back to 3000 BC and join one of the synagogues there. They wouldn't even be welcome in the new synagogues, I'm sure, because I know that many of them have seen this very light. Now then, the point is omnipresence. Omnipresence, all presence. And that makes clear to you why Scripture says the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Can you accept that? That the place whereon thou standest is holy ground? And the first answer would be no, I can't accept it because I know I'm not worthy to be called God. And how right you would be from the standpoint of our human presentation of ourselves. But that does not change the fact that we have lived in ignorance of the fact of omnipresence, and that actually I am the presence of God. I am the showing forth of God. Certainly, we don't always act like that because we have built up this other selfhood called Joel or Bill or Mary, and sometimes we're accustomed to pleasing it. That doesn't mean we always will, because someday we'll awaken to the fact that if I am the presence of God, I must act like it. Now, you never will act like the presence of God. You never will live by grace until you make the acknowledgement, until you know the truth. I am the presence of God. I am that place where God shines through. I am that place where God is fulfilling himself individually. I and my Father are one. And the Father is saying, Son, thou art ever with me. See, even in those old days, I told you, he didn't talk to daughters. But if we rewrite the Bible, we'll include, sons and daughters, thou art always with me. I have been accused of rewriting the Bible, but in this way I will be guilty. Sons and daughters, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. But you must know this truth before this truth can set you free. You shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. But first know it. What must you know? We started with omnipotence, all power. And this means every time I become aware of some negative power, material power, mental power, I am to realize or know the truth within myself. Omnipotence means spirit is the only power. Spiritual law is the only power. Spiritual grace is the only power. Every time I become aware of a presence, whether it's a person or a condition or a thing, contrary to what we know God to be, We have to know the truth. Omnipresence. I will not believe what my eyes see. I will not judge by the hearing of my ear. I will judge righteous judgment and declare God is omnipresent, therefore Spirit is the only presence, therefore the only presence is Spirit and spiritual law and spiritual life and spiritual formations, even though my eyes cannot see that. Remember, spiritual truth can never be known by the mind. The mind can never grasp spiritual truth. It can declare it, it can read it in books, but it can never accept it. There must be a soul faculty which we call spiritual discernment. It is that inner discernment that tells you something is true even when you can't see it, hear it, taste it, touch it, or smell it. It is something, for instance, that tells you there is a God. Now remember, you have no evidence, no physical evidence that there is a God, nor have you any evidence that would satisfy your mind. Can't be. You can say that only God can make a tree, but you can't prove it. There is no way, actually, to prove God through reason. That is why the Bible makes so much of the word faith. It isn't really faith at all. Faith won't get you anywhere, any more than reason will. There has to be an actual inner conviction that knows in spite of opposing sense testimony. If you were a metaphysical healer and called to a very sick person, you couldn't sit there and look at the symptoms and say, oh, well, it's too bad, I can't do anything about it. Or if you were called to a patient of 90, you couldn't say, oh, well, you're old enough to die. The life of one is as precious as the life of another. The age has nothing to do with that. Therefore, in spite of any evidence that confronted you, you would have to have some inner discernment that would say, I know thee who thou art, child of God, spiritual being, the fruitage of omnipresence. And with that spiritual discernment, which is the light of truth, the darkness would disappear, and yet it wouldn't go any place because it wasn't any place to begin with. There wasn't any such thing as darkness. Now, all of this remains in the realm of theory or belief until you take this next step. In this next step, you will find that you solve the mystery of spiritual power. Do not have God and you. God is manifested as you. God is incarnated as you. God's life is your individual life, and you have no other. You have no life of your own. Only the life of God is made visible as your life. God is your mind. You have no Joel mind or Bill mind or Mary mind. You have no young mind and no old mind, and you have no stupid mind or intelligent mind. There is only one mind, and the mind of God is your mind. Otherwise you have two-ness, and two-ness is the secret of the world's discords, a sense of separation from God. Now there is no separation from God. The relationship is I and the Father are one. That's our relationship. But we entertain a sense of separation built on the fact that we've created an identity called Joel, Bill, Mary, and so forth. But the truth is, and you must know the truth if you would be made free, the truth is that God, divine life, is your life. God, the divine mind, is your mind. God, the immortal soul, is your soul. God, divine being, is your being. And your body is the temple of God. Now this is the truth that you must know that makes you free. It is not a prayer to God to do something. It is not a prayer to God to remove something. It is not seeking a God power. It is knowing the truth. And this knowing the truth is spiritual power, because it sets you free from a mental effort to do something, be something, achieve something, accomplish something. It sets you free to let your mind rest. It sets you free to be still and to know that I am God. I'm not seeking God. I am God. God in the midst of me is mighty. God in the midst of me is mighty. And I am one with God. I am one with the Father. As the wave is one with the ocean, so I am one with God. As the sunbeam is one with the sun, not something separate and apart from it, but an emanation of it. So I am one with God. An emanation of God, but never separate or apart from God, and always having all the qualities and all the quantities of God. All that God is, I am, for we are one and not two. Now it is in this oneness that you find your health, and it is for this reason that when you stop praying for yourself, when you stop all forms of selfish praying or nonsensical praying, as if you would have God do something for you that he isn't at the same moment doing for everyone else, and be satisfied to know the truth, you will find then that the God power, the creative, maintaining, and sustaining power of God is really living your life. I live, yet not I. Christ, the Son of God, is my life, is living my life, is being my life. So you see that the paradox of God being all power and God being none power is just in this. God is the all power, the all creative, maintaining, and sustaining power, but God is not a power that is going to do something for you. God is not a power that is going to do something to something else or to somebody else. The power that God is eternal, infinite, omnipotence, omnipresence, omniscience. Oh, I guess we had to get around to that word eventually, didn't we? Omniscience, all science, all wisdom, all knowledge. And now what must you think of someone who's trying to tell God what they need? The all-knowing mind, omniscience, the all-wisdom. And I'm saying, God, send me my rent next Monday. You know, if God had a sense of humor, he'd wink and tip his halo. I'm sure he'd say, are you telling me? But you see, you say, then why doesn't God meet all these rents? God can only operate through your consciousness, not through ignorance, through your consciousness. As long as you set God up here with the ability to send you something next Monday, you are entertaining a sense of separation from God and a sense of limitation about God. Only as you yourself can eliminate next Monday and can eliminate a giving God or withholding God. Because remember, when you ask God for something next Monday, you're accusing God of withholding. And you were merely saying, come on, God, open your hands and let loose. That's not prayer. That's not treatment. That's paganism. That's ignorance. And God cannot work through ignorance, but only through consciousness. Therefore, to live by grace and to have next Monday's rent this Monday, we stop looking to God for it. And we declare omnipotence, omnipresence, and above all, omniscience. And then we let that omniscience of which the Master spoke. Your heavenly Father knoweth that you have need of these things. But no, we take thought about them, and that taking thought is the barrier between us and God's grace. When we stop taking thought and live in a conscious realization of omnipotence, meaning there's no power to prevent God's grace reaching me, because there is no power. There is only God power, and there is no other power. Therefore, nothing can act as a barrier, not even my past sins. And even my future sins, are going to be forgiven 70 times 7. And the knowledge of that prevents any future sins. Just by knowing in advance that they're forgiven prevents their occurrence. It's a law, a spiritual law. You'll see it operate. Now, if we live in the realization of omnipotence, we have no powers then creating sin, disease, death, lack, or limitation. We have no powers delaying our good. We have no powers interfering with our life by grace. If we have omnipresence, we have solved the whole mystery. Since there is no God and me, I've been praying to a hole in the sky and expecting it to shower down blessings. But how can I need blessings if omnipresence is true? If I am already the presence of God, what more do I need? In thy presence is fulfillment, and I am that presence. In me is fulfillment. Is. There's no next Monday about it. Omnipresence means I and the Father must be one, and all that God is, I am. It has been described in our work in this way with this illustration. This is a tumbler, but it is made of glass. Therefore, it is a glass tumbler. Now, wouldn't it be folly for the tumbler to pray for glass? Well, we are the form as which God appears on earth. We are the tumbler or body, and God is the substance. God is the substance and the law of our being and of our body. And so we have God praying out to a hole in the air for something that God already is and has. Now let us see this. You do not complete your picture. You do not complete your demonstration while you have God separate and apart from yourself. You can know omnipotence, but you must know omnipresence to put the seal on it. You can know that God is infinite, all power, all good, all life, all wisdom, but then you have to conclude with, and I am the presence of that. That constitutes my being. That which I have just declared about God is the truth about me. And you see, here is your healing treatment or prayer. The realization of is. God is, I am. Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine, for we are one. You can go back to, well, I've forgotten which one of the writings it is now. I think it's Practicing the Presence or Living the Infinite Way, in which is the story of the sage who passed on and went to heaven, knocked at the door. You know the story, you've read it in the books. Well, go back to that, and then remember that as long as you have a selfhood apart from God, you'll be looking around for a God power that doesn't exist because you embody God power. You are the very embodiment of it, and you don't have to pray for it. You have to declare it, realize it. And then, when you come to the final word, omniscience, that brings the smile to your lips. That really brings a laugh sometimes, when you stop to think how many times you've tried to tell the infinite wisdom of this universe, that which could create, maintain, and sustain this universe, and we tried to tell them what we need next Monday. Well, I'm going to leave you with that tonight, because this is really something to ponder and work with. And between now and tomorrow night, please, give yourself lots of time for pondering the idea of omnipotence, omnipresence, omniscience, so that when we come together tomorrow night, you really know you are already the presence of God, and you're not here to look for any more God power than you already embody. Thank you.